and welcome to our session. Our topic this afternoon will be on metrics and data research administration. Our speaker for this hour will be Dr. Saiqa and Qureshi. Dr. Qureshi is a sought-after speaker, a trainer, editor, and writer. She has almost 15 years of experience in research management in both the US and Europe. She is an advocate for data-driven decision-making and currently works for UCSF as the Chief Administrative Officer for Cell and Tissue Biology. She is an NCURA traveling faculty and a member of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, as well as an adjunct faculty on the Master of Research Administration at Johns Hopkins University. As a friendly reminder, this Zoom session will be recorded. Please remember to remain on mute during your presentation and feel free to write your questions or comments in the chat. Dr. Qureshi, at this time, we would like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Christine, for that very kind introduction. I hope everybody can hear me and can see that intro slide, metrics and data in research administration. So what are metrics and data? What do we do with it? And how does it all work? So just a bit of an agenda for today. Just a reminder, put your questions in the chat. I'll be checking in with Christine, who's monitoring our chat. And I will also be, if you have a question, you can also raise a hand. I'm happy to be interrupted during the presentation, and we have some time at the end. A little bit, just a bit of an intro. So we'll do an intro for me, something about defining data and metrics, talking about stakeholders, and then from there, your types of metrics, what visual representation actually means. Then we're going to do a narrative, talk about the who, what, and where, and then do a little conclusion section. So just a bit about me. There was a very kind introduction from Christine, but from an academic perspective, and then work, research, LinkedIn, and my email. So from an academic perspective, I hold a doctorate. I attended Oxford University for my master's degree. I was at University of California, San Diego for undergraduate. I have a master's in sociology. I have a doctorate from the American Institute. The concentration was in social science. It was manipulation and use of data. And then I have an MBA from Imperial College London. Work-wise, I lived in Europe for 10 years as an adult. I did graduate school there. I worked for 6 years. I then came back to the United States and have been in California for almost 8 years, 7.5 years, I would say. I also teach, as I said, for Johns Hopkins as well. In terms of the research work that I still do, I work a lot in the research administration space. I work with a lot of work around age, around how to use data to drive decision-making in particular. So starting with data and metrics. So when we really think about higher education and what this all looks like, why are we here? What are we doing? What are you going to see possibly as a research administrator? So in higher education, there is a trend towards data-driven decision-making. Research administration is no exception to that. How can you support that kind of decision-making with the tools and the staff that you have? And what should you use that data for? What is data? How do you use metrics? When do you push them out? What do you do with them? Data can be useful to consider things like the time it takes you to set up an award, the percentage of success rates per department for applications submitted to sponsors, IDC recovery rate averages, contract negotiation timelines. In terms of metrics, let's just do some easy definitions. A business metric is a quantifiable measure that's used to track and assess the status of a business process. It's important to note that these metrics are used to address key audiences surrounding a business, like investors or customers, in our cases, different stakeholders. And there is a difference between data and metrics. A metric contains a single type of data, like video views or equipment donations, and a successful organization can only measure so many things well. So we want to think about what those measures tie to. They need to tie to definitions of success. So are you a more successful pre-award office because you have fewer days from receipt to setup of award, receipt of notice of award to setup of award? Metrics are what you measure. And what you measure is what you measure to, or what you manage to. So good metrics have 3 key attributes. They're consistent, they're cheap, and they're quick to collect. So a good rule of thumb is if you can't measure results within a week for free and you can't replicate that process, then you might be prioritizing the wrong thing. So let's talk a little bit about what you would use this data for. So there are many things you can use data for, to present what you've done so far, to present changes over time, to support an argument or resources, or make an argument for more resources. A key piece of data is a metric or quantifiable measure. Every type of work has performance measurements that can be tracked or measured. So basically, I kind of wanted to think about what are your key things. So a performance benchmarking is where you compare qualitative data like key performance indicators. So how one school in Florida does against other schools in Florida in terms of a ranking of research dollars brought in, for instance. There's also practice benchmarking. So these are all types of benchmarking. Practice benchmarking, which uses qualitative information about how a process is undertaken or staff or technology is used to identify performance gaps and apply best practice. There's also internal and external benchmarking. So internal compares metrics across units in an organization. What's your percentage of success for your engineering school versus your med school versus your school of liberal arts? Versus external benchmarking, which is across metrics in one organization to another. For instance, what is your engineering school's rate of success for grant applications versus MIT versus different Florida schools? So that would be those would be internal versus external. And in many cases, you have a benchmarking bench. So for instance, if you know you're an R1 or an R2 school, you know comparable schools either regionally or nationally that may have a research administration group that's a similar size. So who are your key stakeholders? So I really want to talk about this because this is really important, because you might need to tailor what you give to different audiences in different ways, and where do their interests converge. So some key people: PIs, business officers, chairs or deans, central office managers and staff, department or lab personnel. So your department and lab personnel might want to know amount of time it takes to approve a PO, amount of time it takes to for pre-award, amount of time from winning an award to set up. Your PIs and business officers might be more interested in some of your financial metrics. Your central office is going to be interested in things like setup times and if you're meeting service level agreements, perhaps, to other stakeholders. What type of metrics? What are your key types of metrics? So we need to really approach data intelligently. So what are the key metrics that we're interested in? Maybe potentially dollar expenditures, funding levels. We always see this one. Who has brought in what money this year on this fiscal year? Timelines, award processing turnaround, volumes, transactions by officer and by department, objectivity and subjectivity. So you can add some weighted variables here. So if you guys are interested in the chat, I know there's a lot of people. What are some metrics that you use now in your offices? So if you guys want to put that in the chat, if you feel comfortable, what are some, now that I've talked about what metrics are, what are some metrics that you see? Organizational strategy, that IDC recovery rate, there are departments that run that at a departmental level, a school level. So that is one that people will talk about. Volumes of transactions is also something that we'll sometimes have people chat about as well. Expenditure and funding levels, number of proposals. So number of proposals submitted and then percentage awarded. Those are two very key metrics. Cost transfers and closeout refunds. Closeout refunds is a hot metric, and so is grant publications. When proposals, percentage of proposals or number of proposals coming in prior to 3-day turnaround. Negotiation timelines. So a big metric that we see a lot is this timeline one, right? So the timeline metric is from one action to a completed action, how long is it taking? That's when we see a lot. And turnaround times. So time is a big metric that we see. Some more, when we talk about types of metrics and what we need to talk about here, we also really see that we need to present data, like types of graphs. We need to think about some examples of reports. We see collections reports, award reporting, award, subaward timeline reporting. We sometimes see in more advanced setups some stories telling in some resource discussion. If you guys want to pop in the chat, what kind of metrics do you see when you think about reporting and how what's sent out? What are you currently receiving, or what is your office currently sending out? You guys, I'll give you a second here to pop some ideas in the chat. What kind of metrics are you sending out now in a report format out to some stakeholders? Either proposal, award number, building everything from the ground up, input would be fabulous. Financial and monthly new arrears. Yes, arrears and collections is a big one. Monthly financial reports is a big one. Submitted per specialist, awards. Okay, some universities have like metrics even on their website that's available to all faculty to be able to see what's happening. Sponsored, burn rates, award volume, breakout by sponsored award. And sometimes you'll see monthly or quarterly financial reporting too that will report no cost extensions, extensions with dollar amount, new awards awarded as well. So that's fantastic. Okay, we want to talk a little bit about what this could look like. So I have mocked up some data here from, it says Fake 2020. And in Fake 2020, Fake 2020, which is when I mocked this up for, we have something I'm calling days to close. I left it so vague because this could be days to close anything. That could be days to close an award after closeout. It could be average days to close a task, basically. And so I oscillated it over a year. And I want to use this to kind of think about and go through some examples of how to visually represent our data. So what it should look like. The next key question is, what should this look like? There's nothing wrong with a table, but this is not really bringing this to life. I'm a really big advocate for the use of visually representing your data. This is very flat, and for your faculty, it might be, and other stakeholders, it might be very hard for them to access the information you're giving them in this way. If you look at it, our low point here is 10, our high point is 22, but this is a very flat way to represent this data. So you can't assume your audience is data literate or numerate, and you have to move through the arguments you're making using your data. So you need to signpost from the outset to your final argument, and you need to unpack your statistical vignette and walk your audience through your argument. So a table is useful. This table is flat. Here we have columns, but there's different ways. There's really different ways of doing this. And I really want to talk some more about what this could look like. So I'm a big advocate for the big three. There are three really strong types of visualizations. The first is the line chart, and that is a trend or progression over time and has categories of data. The column or bar chart is a comparison among different items or items over time, and the pie chart is shows you how many pieces make up a whole, and it can show numbers or a percentage. And so these are easily created in Excel. So everything I'm showing can be done in Excel. When you're presenting your data, you need to really consider some key things. All a graph is a visual representation of your data. And these we learn in elementary school. So I'm going to start with axes. The axes of a graph help to label and give context to the data displayed on a graph. Depending on the graph style you select, you're going to choose your different axes to display. And you're going to coordinate it. So the relationships are shown in a coordinate grid. So you have your axes, your X and your Y axes. So this is a reminder of elementary school math for most of us. And don't worry, there'll be visuals after this. The next key is really scale. Typically the X axis describes a quantity that changes in a predictable fashion. For example, like minutes, hours, days, or months. So you want it to be a scale that's consistent. And the scale of the X axis changes depending on the type of data you want to record, which is usually linear, which is 1 unit of length along an axis. A horizontal scale would represent days from 0 to 14. And then a scale could be a day, or it could be a month, or it could be a year. The vertical axis on the graph is perpendicular, and it is called the Y axis. That scale normally starts at 0. Occasionally it does not. It describes the outcome variable that is affected or controlled by the variable on the x-axis. So the typical thing with line graphs is you have to think that you're doing trajectory modeling. So a trajectory describes the course of a measurement variable over age or over time. Normally, hierarchy modeling and latent curve analysis is used to measure these relationships, there is, I think that I would refer to this more as really trajectory modeling. So I want to show an example. So here we are, days to close, and the scale goes from 0 on the left side. Our scale goes from 0 to 25 days. That's a little bit above. So when you do your scaling, you usually want it to be about 10%, 6 to 10% higher than your highest point. That's considered a nice scale. 0, and then we have all the months along, and it's divided by month. You could do it by quarter, but our data was by month. Each is evenly spread apart. Each one is identified so that if someone is visually impaired, and this is inserted into presentation as a table, do not insert it as a picture. That means that somebody's audio reader will be able to read the X and the Y axes. It will be able to read every point, and it will say January 20, 10, February 20, 22, and it will read each point to them. So it's really important that we make sure we're inclusive. We have a nice days to close. Here is our nice labeling on our table. So this allows us to sort of see a trajectory, and what we're seeing is a low and then a peak and then a trough. So we're seeing some peaks and troughs along with a consistent upward, another trough, and some increase. So we're seeing some inconsistency in the data, but we're also able to really visualize the range of our data as well. So the line graph is showing our progression over time. And then I've re-shown this as a column and a bar chart. So column and bar just refers to which direction it is oriented, but we have columns and bars, and the column and bar chart is used to show a comparison among items or data over time. A bar chart is a horizontal column and can be helpful with long data labels in particular, and the graphs with more than 10 items because you can make it longer. In research administration, these can be really helpful to visualize comparisons of schools or divisions. So where you're going to see this the most is with comparing schools. So you could see, for instance, the one on the left, you would see maybe School of Engineering, School of Medicine, School of Education, and you would see your different schools in a row in an order, especially with those longer titles. That can be really, really helpful. And then I always like to put this in. This is our other one, which is the pie chart. So this is kind of interesting. The pie chart shows how the pieces make up the total, either with a number or percentage or both. I just put the number here. I did not put the percentage, but what this is going to show you here in this example, days to close is not the best example, but it might be able to show you that certain of the days that were spent closing, that certain months took up a larger percentage. And it's a great tool to show percentages of income in particular from different schools or divisions to really show. I've also used it for medium, large, small, and medium awards, and you can see where your percentage of dollars are coming from. So what we discovered at UCSF is that a very large percentage of our dollars come in on our 40 biggest awards. So we have thousands of awards at any given time, but the 40 largest awards that are over $10 million each are about 40% of our income, which is really fascinating information to be aware of. Do you guys want to pop in the chat and really like kind of talk about what you're seeing now? So where are you seeing visual representations now? And what, when you do see line, I'm going to go back to a line graph, or the bar charts actually, column and bar charts, what do you use them for? Are you using the line, the column, and the bar? Maybe even the pie, and then what do you see that? What do you use it for, and what data are you showing in that way? So I'm just going to wait for some comments in the chat. Let's see if people are putting their data into any kind of visual representation, or are you guys just using tables? Just put it in there if you're just using tables as your primary way to transmit information. Agency trends. We use the bar, line, and graph, pie chart. Okay, so I'm looking at some of the responses here. Okay, great. Okay, agency trends, certain departments over other departments, and especially departments over time. We use bar, line, and pie. We use the pie chart to see workload for each team member. I've seen that as well. Funding by year, growth over time using a line, current or 5-year averages, annual and monthly reports, metrics for advocating to leadership. Absolutely. We're going to talk about that later also. Pie charts to see how PI time is being separated between projects. Okay, Kristen Ebner, I love that one. I have not seen that myself, but I think that is a fantastic use of a pie chart. So you can pull up your PI, you do his percentages, and then you visualize it and say, perhaps when you're doing your award verification process, you have the numbers and the numbers are flat, but like this is your actual pie chart. Does this feel right? Pie charts are good to show funding plots. Grants submitted versus grants awarded. I agree. That's also really important. Bar and line graphs, volume and grant expenditures, between colleagues, bar charts, trends over time, workload trends by month, over time to advocate for staff support and positions. Absolutely. Workload trends are very key for that. And I think the weighting metrics, which we'll talk about, can be really helpful. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to use data, right? So we've talked a little bit, okay, question. What kinds of metrics can be used for clinical trials? Can we have metrics for coordinators? Yes, you can. So there's all kinds of metrics for clinical trials. It depends if you mean for the research coordinators themselves. There can be metrics over like the number of awards. If they're giving financial remuneration, you can run metrics around remuneration, around patient contact, around patient involvement over the, you can do it on the number of trials, the dollar value. I'm a little tricky about dollar value because sometimes one very large study can be easier to manage than 10 small ones. And so sometimes we unfairly maybe criticize a portfolio that has made up of many small pieces because those can actually be trickier to manage than than a portfolio with just one large project. But yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Neva. Okay, so how do we use data? So generally speaking, how you visualize the data will depend on what you want to show or demonstrate. Choosing the wrong graph or only one visualization can cause some confusion or lack of clarity for the reader. There's 5 key uses of data that I want to kind of talk about. Comparing value. A chart can show one or many value sets, especially the lows and highs. So you want to compare data, especially when you see those peaks and troughs. Sometimes you want to show a composition. That's how the individual parts make up the whole of something, like the income for each school in your university. So that's like where a pie chart might be really useful. Another is distribution of data. That can help you see outliers and also a normalized tendency and the full range. And you can use a line, column, or bar chart to do that. Another use is analyzing trends of data. That's understanding change over time or how things performed over time in a specific time frame and can be shown with a line or a column. Relationships between data, it shows how one variable relates to one or multiple variables. And you could use this to show how something positively affects or has no effect or negatively affects another variable. So for instance, just because you put more applications out doesn't mean that you actually had a higher percentage of success. You can end up depressing your percentage of success. So instead of 50 applications and winning 5, you put out 100 applications and you still won 5. So by having the percentage and the end, the actual figure, you're going to see that better. So I want to talk a little bit about these key things. So I'm going to start with trends. I pulled data from the FTSE for this. So trends over time. Trends, particularly things that are rising and things that are falling, form the core narrative of many data-driven stories, right? A good example is, this is from the Financial Times. These are recent trends that have been highlighted or used for media-related stories. One is on interest rates and long-term trends on bond yields. Are not encouraging for those who want to see like higher interest rates. So we're seeing lower reductions on those bond yields. So then the other one is about, the one on the right here is about age, right? We know the population is aging. This chart shows us the potential economic impact of those changes by showing the number of people over 65 as a percentage of the working population, 65 being the estimate. And so that is giving us a stronger and stronger example. So we're looking at how things rise or fall over time, but you can, even a flattened trend could still be important. I next want to talk about comparisons. So a common data narrative is comparisons. How can we take a different angle on Twitter's not growing compared to Facebook from 2013 to 2015? And so how Twitter did grow, but if you look at the data on the left, Facebook grew significantly more. And so then the story on the right is the trend this was for the 2016 election, and those gaps and how Clinton came down. Trump did have some ups and downs, but how that went into using opinion poll data, how that looked over a period of time going into that 2016 election. The next is what I think we use the most in higher education. So this is rank order or league tables. So rank order and league tables. Okay, so this is just literally a flat table, and this is what I showed at the beginning. I'm not opposed to this. The one on the left here is a little more sexy. We have Apple, Google, and Microsoft, and you know we got a lot of money, but we really have some visuals here. We're showing our logos. It's not just completely flat. And then the one on the right is even flatter. It is even flatter. So this is the number of shares of content marketing articles for some of these key writers in the marketing space. And again, it's very, very flat. So I argue that I would like to see some better visualization of that data. There's a few different ways of doing relationships. This is something we use a lot in higher education. So this explores a relationship between data. And if you want to show how one factor in particular has impacted other factors or use it as a predictive of another factor, a simple approach to explore relationships is looking to correlate two sets of data. So that's especially important if the correlation is not the same as causation. Well, correlation is not the same as causation. We have to remember that. It can highlight something where you might want to explore a little bit more, or you might want to think about. We're going to look at the relationship between social shares and links. They took a data set of 1 million posts and used Pearson correlation coefficient to measure linear correlation between two variables. The research implies that people share and link to content for different reasons. And the data also suggests that research and data posts achieve relatively high levels of links. So this is on the left. And then one of the most famous examples of exploring data relationships was highlighted in the film Moneyball. So I am trying to make it cool, guys. The film Moneyball. So this is baseball data. In exploring baseball data, it was found that some surprising factors were correlated with the team's win percentage, and one of them was the OPS differential. That is an on-base plus slugging data variable. I am not a sports fan myself, but I have checked this with sports fans and I have watched the film. This adds together a player's on-base percentage, the percentage of time a player gets on base, and the average number of bases a player reaches when they come to the plate or slug, try and hit the ball. The data they found was a strong correlation between OPS and win percentage. That is the factor that is the key. Your OPS differential and win percentage was the highest correlation in the sport of baseball. You can also talk about surprising or counterintuitive data. So some of the best narratives from data come from, and from research come from where we find surprising or counterintuitive stuff. There was some data that five glasses of champagne a day can prevent Alzheimer's disease. And for there was an article and they decided to look at the surprising data. But for this piece, I have pulled US incarceration rates. The chart above shows US incarceration rates relative to other OECD countries. That's on the left. The US has a higher incarceration rate even than China and Russia, and higher numbers of people are incarcerated in this country. It's really intriguing, and they basically found on the second data on the right that the US had very similar data to other countries until the 1980s, and then it really increased significantly, which is what you see on the right. It really begged the question, as to why that happened, and what the evidence seems to indicate that it was the privatization of prisons and a different approach to incarceration for drug crimes that may be responsible. So again, I know this can be a politically sensitive subject, but I chose a range of examples, not just research administration, and this is one of the ones that I did choose. When should you be reporting? So let me pause actually. Were there any questions about what you visually represent and how and why? And if you want to just pop them in the chat. Thank you, Robin Ping. Oh my goodness, 15 years of baseball for your brother. That is amazing. I love that. I tried to pull some interesting data, so I hope you guys enjoyed the baseball examples and some of the contemporary examples as well. Are there any questions about the visual representation stuff that we've gone through? Okay, all right. So when should you be reporting? Well, always the optimum question. So we're going to talk about frequency. So how frequently should you be reporting? You need to be, the frequency is going to really relate to your subject matter. And for performance, you need to gauge, you kind of need to gauge that over time. You need an impact before and after. You need long enough to gauge impact, your audience, and when they want to see an impact. So you need to, particularly if you're putting a change into place, you need to think about what your metrics are going to be and then make sure that you can identify those metrics. When it comes to standards, those tend to be, standards are important for compliance. So for our example, monthly reports to NSF, human subjects, for instance, if you do award verification, and let's say you do award verification quarterly, you're going to want a metric every single quarter to make sure from a compliance perspective that you are meeting those standards as expected. In terms of when and the timing, you don't want to inundate anyone. Sometimes you need to think about when action is actually needed. Place messaging around a call to action with your data or your metrics. We need to know our audience. So we're going to talk some more about audience in the next slide, but you need to think about who will see this, what they will do with it, and what they want to do or know. And then how you package and deliver it. So are you emailing it? Is it on your website? And are people downloading it? Is it live all the time, like a dashboard and they can pull it? And how are you packaging it? I find that people send what I call naked data. They send raw, naked, unfiltered data out, or they slightly filter the data in a flat way. My argument is that in order for your data to be useful to your stakeholders, you really need to package your data. So you need to turn it into a report and you need to have very clear commentary, what happened, why it is impactful, what you need the stakeholder to do with it. That is what needs to happen, because otherwise we have so many stakeholders who are not numerate and not data literate, and they don't understand what it is, and they don't tell you that they don't actually understand it. So I've worked for teams that have just produced reams of material, and I'm not convinced that anyone knew what to do with it. So we do want to make sure that we're supporting our stakeholders to be successful. So where are our reports going? Our audience is really key. We have to think about an internal or an external audience. So internally, who is our audience? Who needs to know these key metrics? And then externally, what can be shared? Management tools versus personal workload organization. So from a management tool perspective, is this to manage other teams, or is this for your team to know for themselves, hey, last week you did 100 items and this week you only did 50? PIs and business officials. So business officials or business officers, how is it helping them to drive decision making? Department versus central leadership, who's doing what, and how will this data help them? What data do they need to drive decision making? And what's our visualization and what's our spreadsheet summary? So why certain metrics? So this is really very, very critical. And I'm going to have you guys, as I start this, why don't you guys put in the chat which metrics you think are really critical? So now that we've been through a big percentage of our presentation today, and you've seen what other people have put in the comments, why don't you put in the comments what you think your key metrics are? So I'm just going to give people a moment here. to put their key metrics into the chat. The key metrics they think are really important for research administration. Turnaround times. Thank you, Celeste. Absolutely. People are really interested in turnaround times. And that's an internal external audience, particularly faculty. Proposals versus awards won, volume data, submission data. So up here. So I'm seeing turnaround times, proposals versus awards. So that's really talking about the number of proposals that went out versus the number of awards that were actually awarded. That data can be a little tricky. The way that I've usually seen it done is proposals like that went out this month versus awards that were won this month, which is not a direct correlation because many times it can take 3 to 12 months before you know if you've won an award. Award volume, submission success rate, very, very critical. That's easier to do per department. Volume, submission timeline and turnaround processing time. Funding rates are very critical. What I don't see on here that I think comes up a lot is in indirect recovery rates. So if you're on the financial side, those indirect recovery rates are really critical. There are a lot of departments that track those really tightly. Funding sources, absolutely, Tina, fantastic point. You could do a visual with representing the diversity of funding sources or a pie chart with your percentage from federal, state, private foundation as a different way of doing that, or contracts versus grants. So what percentage are contracts, what are grants? A big data point for funding sources is federal versus non-federal altogether to see if you're above that or below that 50-50 threshold. Hit rates, expenditure, funding by type of sponsor, absolutely. Cost share, Stephanie Keto, thank you so much. Cost share is also critical. We want to see cost share, voluntary and non-voluntary cost share, that's big. Funding versus expenditure is also very, very large. Absolutely, those are some key and really critical pieces. And we're going to talk a little bit about why and what. So don't report or analyze things just because you can. Okay, how many glasses of champagne do I need to keep my sanity? I love that. That's true. Capital assets page. I love that. It's interesting with the glasses of champagne because one of the biggest issues with alcohol consumption is measurement. And so what's a glass of wine? And so a glass is not like, the large one that's meant to aerate the wine and, and people can get a whole bottle in there. That's not one glass. And so measurement, a standard unit of measurement can be really, really tricky. What is a day? I've had this debate. What does a day mean? Does a day mean business days or does it mean calendar days? Because I've had faculty who were like, well, I had 5 days. I got it to you on Friday at like 6 p.m. So why wasn't it done by Wednesday? Well, we didn't start counting till Monday morning. So you'll be lucky you get it by Friday. So how do you count your units and how do you define them? Shockingly, the converse is not true. If it has to get there 3 days before and they get it in on Saturday or Sunday, they still think they cool, even though it's due like Monday afternoon. So the days only count in their advantage, not the opposite. Capital assets, absolutely true. You want to be tracking that as well. And depreciation is something that we track. So I wanted to kind of think about metrics. So I think one that gets lost a little bit is a faculty consideration, tenure related to research activity. So what percentage are up for tenure? How is it tying to them? Those who are tenure eligible, what support are they receiving? What is their pre-award and post-award looking like? Stakeholder considerations are going to be things around monitoring, around assessment, around setting goals. So if you do not have, setting a service level agreement goal that is not realistic for the volume of work and the manpower sets nobody up for success. It just doesn't. It sets no one up for success. So if you are at the staffing level that you are at with the amount of work you have, you may have to change. You may have to go back out to the community to argue that you either have to shift the service level agreement or you have to change another piece of the calculation. And that is something that this will help you do. Because the goal setting a goal that things are turned around in 5 days when you don't have the manpower to do it and are not looking likely to do so is going to be really tricky. Tracking effort, release salary and PI by department. Absolutely. I've also seen a university that tracked class releases. Course releases was a big track. because what it affects is percentage of classes taught by adjuncts. So it looks great to win research, and then it looks great to buy out faculty time from class. Okay, fine, you did class buyouts, but at some point you're not teaching enough of your tenured not enough of your tenured faculty are actually teaching on your courses, and that's causing some concerns for the percentage of classes being taught by adjuncts. Again, it's an interesting metric that I wasn't as familiar with. Quantity of grad students and postgraduate students, we track this as well. What number of postgrad and graduate students do we have in our labs at any given time? So stakeholders, staffing levels based on volume, as I kind of discussed, this is really critical. Has your volume gone up? Are you adding staff, or are you innovating your systems? At some point, you can't just keep adding people. You have to innovate the systems and processes that you use. The standards set based on average turnaround times, strategy, kind of policies based on data, i.e. IDC exceptions. If you're seeing a lot of IDC exceptions, you are going to see an impact on your bottom line. And by having that recovery information, you're going to know about it. So that's going to be really, really, really critical. So how do we analyze a report, or what are our conclusions and takeaways here? Product analysis is really, really important. So it's pricing and effectiveness. So this is kind of a very like business term or business phrasing that we put in here, but what is the effectiveness? What is it costing you to provide a provision of service? And this is a metric that we don't tend to use, but I think is really, really critical, and we should not shy away from. Sometimes it's important to consider what a task actually costs in human labor. And if that is where, when we have limited resources, we want to put our human labor and therefore our financial resourcing costs. Internally and externally, we need to find a balance between reporting and actually doing the work. So we need to balance between kind of transparency and efficiencies. So we want to be transparent, but as I said at the beginning, you need to really, really think about how to do metrics cheaply and easily. We need to know our audience. We need to tell a story, and we want to consider how to present our data. When you are presenting data out to an audience, you need to walk them through a narrative, and you need to walk them to your conclusion. Do not allow them to come up with a conclusion themselves because you don't know where they're going to get. And in many cases, they just won't look at the data, or they find it overwhelming. Communication really matters. What is your frequency? What is your substance? Are you having a push or pull? Are you pushing data out on email, or are they pulling data down from a website? Stakeholder needs really depend, but we want to find intersections in our needs, and metrics can really fuel strategic decision making. So we want lay people to be able to understand metrics. That's our goal here. You need to assume that the person reading it, and I work with primarily scientists, but you have to assume that they are not data literate. You have to assume that they are not numerate, they're not data literate, that they're not actually able to analyze and critically evaluate what you're sending them. You need to analyze, and you need to critically evaluate, and then you need to create a narrative and make an argument and walk them through using your data. I would say email, statement, data vignette to back it up, unpack, argument, action desired. That's what we're looking at. And so that's kind of the methodology or approach that I would advocate for, because what I really see is a lot of people sending flat data, large amounts of it out to stakeholders with no call to action and a lack of clarity. And I see a comment from Charity, thank you. Even if they know data, they don't understand business data. That's correct. I can repeat the steps, absolutely. So what I would argue you want to do is you want to make a statement of what is there. You then want to add the statistical vignette or your visual to back that up. You unpack it, and then you're making an argument about a change or what's happening or causality. And that's what you want to do for each of your key pieces of metrics or data. And yes, I believe the slides will be provided. I've provided them. I'm happy for the slides to be PDF'd and shared. So I will make sure that that's available, and this is also being recorded. But also I put at the beginning, my LinkedIn is there. It's SAQ2 is me on LinkedIn, Saiqa and Qureshi. And please follow me or add me on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to have people do that. And I put up all kinds of stuff, and I will PDF this and put this up as well. So I really want to, I really want to kind of open it up now. We have about 15 minutes. It's pretty good timing. I'm going to stop sharing because I think that helps facilitate. When I stop sharing, I find that it really helps facilitate discussion. So I am super excited in any way to help. Please, the time is now open. We have about 15 minutes. So let's get some questions in there, or chat or unmute or whatever works for everybody. So what are thoughts or questions or anything you'd like me to review or go through again? Let's see. I'd asked for, it was one comment to reiterate, and I did that. So is there anything else you'd like me to review, or any comments or thoughts? Please unmute or pop in the chat. All right, why don't we use the chat, and what are some metrics that, after seeing this presentation, you would now like to see for your university? What are metrics you want to see, or you think your faculty or your PIs or your business stakeholders would want to see now, that you maybe don't do now, or you think you need to change or shift? So let's put some of those in the chat and think about what might be useful. Okay, I'm gonna wait for a couple more comments. Timeline from award receipt to setup. Yeah, if you don't provide that, that can be really, really useful, especially because sometimes a PI gets a heads up email before an official letter goes out. And so they definitely maybe think differently about what that timeline looks like. PI distribution of time is a great idea. I agree, Amanda. I think that on a pie chart is fabulous. When you, our award verification does not have that currently. And I'm going to suggest that to them, because I think a visual representation that says, does this match? Is this correct? Is really, really helpful. Thank you, Elizabeth. All slides, recordings, and materials will be sent out after the conference. Thank you for confirming. Pie chart of effort, fantastic. Are there any kind of other thoughts? Okay, in your experience, how often do you think faculty are interested in seeing metrics? So they tend to want to see metrics when they're unhappy because they didn't get something done fast enough. And then they sometimes don't believe them. So if they have one lived experience that something took 4 weeks to set up because, you know, we're negotiating with the European Union, so that's a very protracted multi-month experience, they then get upset. So then sometimes showing that like the norm is actually 5 to 10 days, that you're an outlier. And your outlier experience is because, but I would argue that it can also be helpful that we can argue that the European Union will always be an outlier. How often are they interested in seeing metrics? I like to say we do a quarterly faculty meeting. So if you're in a department, it could be useful to have a couple of metrics that are key metrics, and maybe show those quarterly for everybody and walk them through. I agree with burn rates of funds over the course of a project. And then what do you use to track your metrics for your team? So you can use Excel, and then you can link your Excel into a PowerPoint to show for your team, or you can use Smartsheets. A lot of people like Smartsheets, and they feel they can set up like almost like a dashboard with it, which some people can find to be a very useful tool. Yeah. It's good to know our own data for those outlier reasons you cite. We should warn, prepare PIs when they know, yes, exactly, Charity, when you know you're going to be an outlier. When I see people get upset about the EU, I get frustrated with our pre-team for not telling them. If it's going to be EU, it's going to be 2 months. And if it's August, it's the month of August just doesn't count in Europe. So, I mean, I worked in Britain for years. It doesn't count. So if you get something in the middle of July for your PI and you're starting negotiations, it's going to be end of September. Easy. You could be looking at October. So it's just not going to happen. And I just wish that we would use that information to pre-warn someone, this is going to be a protracted negotiation. We will do our best, but this is what we're looking at. So yeah, I totally agree. Are there any other metrics, any other questions or any other key metrics that you think you're now going to think about and think about for the future? All right. I think we're just a couple minutes early, but if there's no other questions, I think I'll kind of defer back to our leadership here for our conference. If there's no more questions to kind of step back in.
Thank you, Dr. Qureshi. And